The Imperial Japanese fleet steamed toward Midway with a single massive objective: capture the atoll, force the weakened American Pacific Fleet into a desperate rescue attempt, and destroy it once and for all. The entire operation relied on surprise and the absolute assumption that the Americans would only react after the initial strike had fallen. But when a Japanese scout plane finally transmitted a delayed report of American ships to the northeast, Admiral Nimitz's 3 carriers were already waiting in position, and the first American strike groups were already in the air. How does a meticulously engineered operation, designed to annihilate the remnants of the United States Pacific Fleet, instantly collapse into an inescapable ambush for its creators? On May 5, 1942, Imperial General Headquarters issued Navy Order No. 18. It directed Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto to execute Operation MI. The objective was straightforward on paper: occupy Midway Atoll and key points in the western Aleutian Islands. But the island itself was just bait. Yamamoto calculated that threatening Midway, an outpost just over 1,000 miles from Hawaii, would force Admiral Chester Nimitz to throw his surviving aircraft carriers into a desperate counterattack. Once the Americans rushed into the open ocean, the Japanese 1st Mobile Strike Force, commanded by Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, and built around 4 veteran fleet carriers, would intercept and crush them. Yet the architecture of Operation MI was dangerously overcomplicated. Yamamoto scattered his massive armada into widely separated groups across the Pacific. Nagumo's 4 carriers sailed as the vanguard, while Yamamoto's main body of heavy battleships trailed hundreds of miles behind, far too distant to provide immediate support if the tactical situation suddenly changed. The entire strategy rested on one rigid, fatal assumption regarding the American timetable. Japanese planning dictated that the United States Navy would only begin to mobilize after the first bombs struck Midway. Yamamoto expected absolute operational surprise, ample time to bombard the atoll, and a clear strategic picture long before any American warships could possibly arrive. The hunted were supposed to react on Tokyo's schedule. Instead, they were already holding their positions in the dark.
Which raises the defining question of the campaign. What exactly did the Americans know, and how did they piece together Japan's most closely guarded operational timetable in time to turn the trap inside out? Before that intelligence could be gathered, the trap itself had to be built, and its construction began at the Hashirajima Fleet Anchorage in mid-May 1942, bathed in an atmosphere of absolute, almost intoxicating invincibility. For 6 months, the Imperial Japanese Navy had swept across the Pacific and Indian Oceans like a scythe. They had dismantled the American battleship Roe at Pearl Harbor, sunk the British Force Z off Malaya, flattened Darwin in Australia, and driven the Allied navies out of the Java Sea. This uninterrupted streak of tactical triumphs had birthed a psychological phenomenon within the Japanese High Command known as victory disease. It was a profound institutional overconfidence, breeding the belief that their adversaries lacked the martial spirit to mount a coordinated, aggressive defense. This mindset did not just color the atmosphere in the wardrooms. It directly infected the architecture of Navy Order No. 18. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet, understood that Japan could not win a protracted war of industrial attrition against the United States. He needed to force a decisive, annihilating fleet action in the summer of 1942, before American shipyards could begin pumping out new fleets. Midway Atoll was selected not for its intrinsic value. It was little more than 2 specks of coral and sand surrounding a lagoon, encompassing barely 2 square miles of dry land, but strictly for its geography. Sitting just over 1,100 miles northwest of Oahu, it was a dagger pointed directly at the throat of the Hawaiian Islands.
Yamamoto knew Admiral Nimitz could not afford to let it fall. By threatening this vital outpost, the Japanese would force the remnants of the Pacific Fleet to steam out of their safe harbors and fight on Tokyo's terms. To execute this masterstroke, the Imperial Japanese Navy assembled the most massive armada the Pacific had ever seen. Over 160 warships were mobilized, requiring a logistical effort of staggering complexity. But instead of concentrating this overwhelming combat power into a single, unstoppable fist, Yamamoto's staff designed a sprawling, fragmented operation. The strategy was rooted in complex deception and multi-axis envelopment. The armada was sliced into distinct, widely separated tactical formations scattered across millions of square miles of empty ocean. Far to the north, a diversionary force was ordered to attack the Aleutian Islands, a move designed to draw American attention and resources toward Alaska. Meanwhile, the Midway Invasion Force, a massive convoy of slow-moving troop transports, cruisers, and escort carriers, approached the Central Pacific from the Marianas. The core of the killing blow, however, lay with Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo's 1st Mobile Strike Force. This was the vanguard, built around the 4 veteran fleet carriers Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, carrying nearly 250 frontline combat aircraft. Nagumo's explicit directive was to act as the tip of the spear.
He was to sail ahead of the main invasion fleet, arrive off Midway undetected, launch a devastating aerial bombardment to pulverize the atoll's defenses, and then loiter in the area, waiting for the American rescue force to arrive. Behind Nagumo, trailing by a deliberate distance of 300 nautical miles, lurked Yamamoto's main body. This formidable surface action group was centered around the brand-new super battleship Yamato, armed with 18.1-inch guns, the largest naval artillery ever put to sea. The logic behind this massive separation was purely doctrinal. Yamamoto wanted to conceal his true strength. If the Americans realized they were sailing into the teeth of the entire Japanese battleship fleet, they might turn back and refuse the decisive battle.
The plan dictated that Nagumo's carriers would engage and weaken the American fleet during the day, and then Yamamoto's heavy battleships would rush forward under the cover of darkness to finish the job in a devastating night surface action. On paper, meticulously charted in the war rooms of Tokyo, it was a masterpiece of naval choreography. In the unforgiving reality of the open ocean, it was a fragile mechanism relying on a disastrously flawed premise. By separating the carrier strike force from the main battleship body by 300 miles, Yamamoto intentionally removed himself from the immediate tactical reality of the vanguard. In an era before advanced radar data links and satellite communications, visual range was the absolute limit of direct situational awareness. To maintain the vital element of operational surprise, the entire armada was placed under conditions of strict radio silence from the moment they sortied. The transmitting keys on the radios were physically locked. Ships could listen, but they could not speak. This meant that Yamamoto, commanding the most complex naval operation in history from the bridge of the Yamato, voluntarily blinded and gagged himself. If the tactical situation suddenly changed, if an enemy carrier was spotted in the wrong place, or a friendly screening vessel reported contact, Yamamoto could not easily coordinate a rapid response without breaking radio silence and instantly revealing his flagship's position to American land-based direction-finding stations. He had built a vast, intricate machine, started the engine, and then stepped away from the controls, trusting that the pre-written timetable would unfold exactly as planned. And that timetable rested entirely on a rigid assumption regarding American behavior. The Japanese operational planners calculated with absolute certainty that the United States Navy was suffering from plummeting morale and operated under a defensive, reactive doctrine. They firmly believed that Admiral Nimitz would keep his surviving aircraft carriers securely moored at Ford Island in Pearl Harbor until the first Japanese bombs physically detonated on Midway's runways. Only then, the Japanese reasoned, would the Americans scramble to assess the situation, organize a sortie, and begin the long steam northwest. This calculated delay was supposed to buy Nagumo a critical window of several days to destroy the island's air forces, support the amphibious landings, and then casually rearm his torpedo bombers to wait in ambush for the late-arriving American ships. To guarantee this sequence of events, Yamamoto's staff did engineer a tripwire. Before the main fleet actions commenced, an advance expeditionary force, consisting of long-range Japanese submarines, was ordered to deploy across the Central Pacific. These I-boats were tasked with forming two distinct underwater picket lines, Cordon A and Cordon B, straddling the projected transit routes between Hawaii and Midway. Their standing orders were simple: run silently on the surface at night, or at periscope depth during the day. Watch the ocean and wait. When the American fleet finally rushed out of Pearl Harbor in response to the Midway attack, they would inevitably have to cross these patrol lines.
The submarines would sight the enemy, immediately break radio silence to broadcast a warning to Nagumo, and the jaws of the trap would close. To supplement the submarine cordons, the Japanese also planned a daring aerial reconnaissance mission designated Operation K. Specially modified Kawanishi flying boats were scheduled to launch from the Marshall Islands, fly thousands of miles over the open ocean, rendezvous with submarines at the remote French frigate shoals for a midnight refueling, and then fly directly over Pearl Harbor to visually confirm that the American carriers were still anchored in port. It was a multi-layered surveillance net designed to confirm what the Japanese already assumed to be true. But this elaborate web of dispersed fleets, strict communication blackouts, and complex reconnaissance cordons placed a crushing, almost impossible operational burden on the shoulders of Vice Admiral Nagumo aboard the flagship Akagi. Navy Order Number 0018 tasked him with a dual mandate that fundamentally conflicted with the physical realities of carrier aviation. He was ordered to reduce the land-based defenses of Midway Atoll while simultaneously maintaining a lethal reserve of aircraft ready to destroy the American fleet. In the cramped, volatile environment of a 1940s aircraft carrier hangar deck, you cannot instantly switch between these two objectives. Bombing an island requires aircraft loaded with 250-kilogram high-explosive bombs designed to crater concrete and shred unarmored structures. Sinking a heavily armored warship requires completely different ordnance, massive 800-kilogram armor-piercing bombs designed to punch through steel decks, and specialized aerial torpedoes built to fracture hulls below the waterline. Changing a carrier air group's armament is not a matter of simply throwing a switch. It is a grueling, highly dangerous industrial process. It requires deck crews to manually winch 1,000-pound weapons down from the bellies of the aircraft, cart them across steel decks slick with oil, lower them via slow elevators deep into the armored magazines, hoist up the new ordnance, cart it back across the hangar, and manually crank it into the bomb bays of the waiting planes. Doing this for an entire strike package takes hours of exhausting labor by hundreds of men, all working in an enclosed space permeated by the fumes of highly volatile aviation gasoline. Yamamoto's plan effectively demanded that Nagumo fight a land battle and a sea battle simultaneously, relying on the premise that the American fleet would politely wait its turn. If the timing of the American arrival deviated from the Japanese script by even 24 hours, Nagumo would find himself caught in a lethal logistical bottleneck, unable to quickly rearm his aircraft to face a sudden naval threat. The entire colossal mechanism of Operation MI, from the northern diversion in the Aleutians to the trailing battleships and the submarine cordons, was inherently fragile. It was a machine built with zero tolerance for friction. It required the Americans to be blind, slow, and entirely predictable. It required the United States Navy to react exactly as Tokyo commanded, moving into the designated kill zones precisely on schedule.
If any single component of the Japanese intelligence apparatus failed, or if the enemy refused to play the role assigned to them, the widely dispersed elements of the Imperial fleet would not form an inescapable trap. They would become isolated, blind targets, sailing disconnected across an ocean that suddenly belonged to the hunted. The Japanese operational timetable demanded that the Americans remain completely blind and entirely reactive. But deep beneath the 14th Naval District headquarters in Pearl Harbor, inside a windowless basement known as the Dungeon, the blindfold had already slipped. Here, the cryptanalysts and linguists of Combat Intelligence Unit Station HYPO, operating under the relentless direction of Commander Joseph Rochefort, were dismantling the illusion of Japanese secrecy. They were not reading enemy orders like an open book. The Imperial Japanese Navy relied on a phenomenally complex operational code designated by the Americans as JN-25B. It was a dictionary of tens of thousands of five-digit groups, further scrambled by random additive numbers. Rochefort's team was breaking perhaps 10 to 15% of the intercepts, working with shattered fragments of syntax, call signs, and sheer mathematical intuition. By late April and early May 1942, they detected a massive, undeniable surge in radio traffic emanating from Tokyo and the combined fleet. Amidst this encrypted static, two letters kept repeating as the ultimate objective of an upcoming offensive: AF. Intelligence officials in Washington argued that AF stood for Oahu, the Aleutians, or perhaps even the American West Coast. Rochefort's unit, utilizing traffic analysis and historical intercept patterns, was convinced AF meant Midway. To prove it, Station HYPO devised a brilliant, low-tech trap. Over a secure submarine cable, Midway was instructed to broadcast a fake administrative message in the clear, unencrypted radio voice, complaining that their seawater distillation plant was broken and they were critically short of fresh water. The bait was laid. Days later, an American listening post intercepted a Japanese intelligence report transmitted in the JN-25 code. The decrypt read, "AF is short of fresh water." The target was confirmed. Over the following weeks, by analyzing the specific call signs of the Japanese warships being assigned to the operation, HYPO pieced together the horrifying scale of the threat. They correctly deduced that a striking force of at least 4 aircraft carriers would arrive off Midway in the first days of June. But this intelligence was not absolute.
It was a mosaic with half the tiles missing. Admiral Chester Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet, was not handed a perfect map of Japanese positions. He did not know the exact location of Yamamoto's trailing battleships, nor could he be certain of the exact hour the Japanese vanguard would strike. What Nimitz possessed was just enough actionable intelligence to make one of the most terrifying calculated risks in the history of naval warfare. If Nimitz committed his forces based on Rochefort's fragmented data and the Japanese actually struck elsewhere, he would leave the entire Pacific coast defenseless. Worse, to even attempt an ambush, Nimitz had almost nothing to throw. He had the carriers Enterprise and Hornet. The Yorktown was heavily damaged from the Battle of the Coral Sea, trailing an oil slick across the Pacific and requiring an estimated 3 months of dry dock repairs. But Nimitz trusted his intelligence officers.
He ordered Yorktown patched together in just a few frantic days, demanding she sail with whatever combat capability she could muster. Nimitz then weaponized the Japanese timetable against them. The entire architecture of Yamamoto's trap relied on his advance expeditionary force, the submarine cordons, being in place to report the American sortie. But because Nimitz knew the rough date of the strike, he did not wait for the bombs to fall. He ordered his 2 carrier task forces to clear Pearl Harbor in the final days of May, steaming northwest to a predetermined rendezvous point codenamed Point Luck, roughly 300 miles northeast of Midway. It was a race against a stopwatch the Japanese didn't know they were sharing. Due to logistical delays and unexpected friction at their forward bases, the Japanese submarines tasked with forming Cordon A and Cordon B did not reach their assigned patrol lines until June 1st and June 2nd. They raised their periscopes and scanned the horizon, fully expecting to wait for the Americans to come rushing out of Hawaii days later. But the ocean was empty. They had arrived on station exactly 2 days too late. Admiral Nimitz's carriers had already slipped through the invisible net. The American fleet was no longer reacting. They were already in the kill zone, running silent and waiting in the dark for Vice Admiral Nagumo to arrive. By dawn on June 4, 1942, Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo stood on the flag bridge of the carrier Akagi, commanding a strike force that believed it held total initiative. The sea was calm, the weather near the Japanese vanguard was heavily overcast, providing excellent cover, and the intricate machinery of Operation M1 appeared to be running smoothly. At 0430, Nagumo ordered the primary strike to launch. 108 aircraft, a mixed formation of dive bombers, level bombers, and Zero fighters under the command of Lieutenant Joichi Tomonaga, roared off the wooden flight decks of the 4 Japanese carriers and formed up in the pre-dawn darkness, setting a course directly for Midway Atoll. Simultaneously, Nagumo adhered strictly to the defensive protocols dictated by Yamamoto's complex plan. He ordered combat air patrols into the sky to protect the fleet and dispatched a line of scout planes to search the vast ocean ahead. However, the Japanese search plan was relatively thin. It was designed primarily to ensure no American forces were lingering unexpectedly near the atoll, rather than to hunt for a mobilized fleet they were certain was still in Pearl Harbor. One of these scout planes, the cruiser Tone's float plane designated Number 4, was delayed on its catapult by a mechanical issue and launched half an hour late. It seemed a trivial logistical hiccup in a massive operation. The physical reality of carrier warfare immediately began to dictate Nagumo's options.
With Tomonaga's strike group away, the hangar decks of the Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu were not empty. Nagumo still held half his total air strength in reserve, a powerful anti-ship strike force of Kate torpedo bombers and Val dive bombers. Following standard doctrine and Yamamoto's explicit orders, this reserve force was kept armed with armor-piercing bombs and heavy aerial torpedoes, ready to instantly strike any American warships that might foolishly venture into the area. Nagumo was fighting a land battle with his right hand, keeping his left hand heavily armed and waiting for a naval battle he didn't expect to fight for days. At 0620, Tomonaga's aircraft arrived over Midway. The Japanese bombers hammered the atoll's infrastructure, destroying buildings, severing communications networks, and crippling the Marine Defense Battalion's anti-aircraft batteries. But the strike found the runways remarkably empty. Nimitz had ensured that almost every operational aircraft on Midway was already airborne, searching for the Japanese fleet or preparing to attack. The atoll was damaged, burning, and battered, but it was not neutralized. At 700, Tomonaga's radio transmission cracked across the bridge of the Akagi. The message was brief and alarming. "There is need for a second attack." For Nagumo, this transmission triggered a cascading logistical crisis that struck at the fundamental flaw of Yamamoto's rigid plan. He was now ordered to execute a second strike on a land target, but the only aircraft he had available were his anti-ship reserve, currently armed with torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs, completely unsuitable for cratering runways. To launch a second strike on Midway, he would have to bring those planes up, strike their heavy anti-ship weapons down to the magazines, haul up high-explosive land bombs, and rearm the entire force. Before Nagumo could even process the logistical weight of this decision, the American response materialized. Not from a distant fleet, but from the island itself. Successive waves of land-based bombers and torpedo planes from Midway began attacking the Japanese carriers. These strikes, executed by Army B-26 Marauders, Navy TBF Avengers, and Marine Corps Vindicators, were uncoordinated, poorly executed, and suffered horrific casualties against the veteran Japanese Zero fighters. None of them scored a direct hit, but their mere presence confirmed Tomonaga's assessment. Midway was still lethal.
The American land-based air power was actively trying to sink his flagship. At 0715, pressured by the continuous attacks and the necessity to suppress the island, Nagumo made the fateful decision that the rigid Japanese timetable could not accommodate. He ordered the reserve force to be rearmed. On the hangar decks below, hundreds of Japanese aviation mechanics began the exhausting, dangerous process of breaking out the torpedoes, unfastening the heavy armor-piercing bombs, and maneuvering them toward the elevators, replacing them with high-explosive bombs intended for the second strike on Midway. The Japanese carriers transitioned from a state of instant anti-ship readiness into a vulnerable, disorganized industrial worksite. Then, at 0740, the fragile architecture of the Japanese plan shattered entirely. A radio message arrived from Tone's delayed scout plane number 4, currently flying far to the northeast. The transmission reported sighting 10 ships, apparently enemy.
The message lacked crucial details. It did not specify the types of ships. It did not mention aircraft carriers, but its mere existence struck the Japanese bridge with the force of a physical blow. The timetable was wrong. The American fleet was not anchored in Pearl Harbor. They were not reacting to the Midway strike. They were already deployed, positioned hundreds of miles closer than anyone in Tokyo had calculated. Nagumo was suddenly trapped in a lethal tactical paradox. He needed to strike this newly discovered enemy fleet immediately, but his only available strike aircraft were currently sitting on the hangar decks, half-armed with high-explosive bombs, completely useless against armored warships. He could not launch them. He ordered the rearming process to halt instantly. The mechanics, already exhausted, were ordered to reverse course, to take the land bombs off, bring the torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs back up from the magazines, and rearm the strike force again for a naval engagement. The hangar decks descended into organized chaos, with live ordnance stacked dangerously along the bulkheads to save time. At 0809, Tone's scout sent an agonizingly vague update. Enemy ships are 5 cruisers and 5 destroyers. A cruiser force was dangerous, but it did not project the lethal reach of naval aviation. For a brief moment, Nagumo might have believed he still held the tactical advantage, but at 0820, the final, devastating clarification arrived. The scout reported, "Enemy force is accompanied by what appears to be an aircraft carrier." The trap had been sprung, and Nagumo was inside it. But he still could not strike back. By 0830, Tomonaga's Midway strike force, low on fuel, heavily damaged, and desperate to land, appeared over the Japanese fleet. Nagumo faced an excruciating choice. If he ordered his reserve force to launch immediately against the American carrier, they would have to take off with a mismatched, disorganized load of weapons, some carrying torpedoes, some carrying land bombs. More importantly, launching a strike takes time. While the reserve force took off, Tomonaga's returning planes would run out of fuel and crash into the sea. Nagumo, adhering to established doctrine and the practical necessity of saving his veteran air crews, chose to recover Tomonaga's strike first. He ordered the flight decks cleared. The Japanese carriers turned into the wind to begin the slow, methodical process of landing the returning aircraft. From 0837 to 0918, the Japanese strike force was locked in this recovery cycle. They could not launch a counterattack. Their combat air patrols were continuously engaged, fighting off another wave of uncoordinated but relentless attacks from Midway-based aircraft. Nagumo was fighting a desperate defensive battle, his carriers executing wild evasive maneuvers, while his hangar decks were clogged with refueling planes and live ordnance. He knew the American carrier was out there. He knew they were within striking distance. What he did not know, because his scout had only seen a fraction of the American force, was that there was not one American carrier to the northeast. There were 3, and their strike groups, torpedo squadrons, dive bombers, and fighter escorts had been launched over an hour ago. They were already in the air, hunting for the Japanese fleet. The American strike groups hunting Nagumo's fleet were not a unified, choreographed fist. Driven by urgency, the American carrier launches had been rushed and disorganized. Squadrons of torpedo planes, dive bombers, and fighters from the Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown became separated in the thick morning clouds. They did not approach as a synchronized wave, but as fractured, isolated units, navigating a featureless ocean on rapidly depleting fuel tanks. The first to find the Japanese vanguard was Torpedo Squadron 8 from the USS Hornet, commanded by Lieutenant Commander John Waldron. At 0920, his 15 obsolete TBD Devastator torpedo bombers dropped toward the surface of the Pacific. They were completely alone. Their fighter escort was nowhere to be found, and the dive bombers had not yet arrived. To drop a Mark 13 aerial torpedo, Devastator crews had to adhere to a suicidal flight profile. The aircraft had to descend to barely 50 feet above the waves, slow down to just over 100 knots, and fly in a straight,
predictable line for hundreds of yards. Against veteran Japanese aviators, it was a death sentence. High above, dozens of A-6M0 fighters flying combat air patrol spotted the incoming squadron. The Zeros plunged, initiating a mechanical slaughter. Waldron and his men pressed their attack into an impenetrable wall of anti-aircraft fire and swarming fighters. Within minutes, all 15 devastators of Torpedo Squadron 8 were shot out of the sky. Not a single torpedo found its mark.
The annihilation of Torpedo Squadron 8 was only the beginning of a relentless hour of extreme pressure. At 0940, Torpedo Squadron 6 from the Enterprise arrived. Attacking through the exact same gauntlet of Zeros and shrapnel, they were decimated. Shortly after 1000, Torpedo Squadron 3 from the Yorktown made its final run. Of the 41 American torpedo bombers that attacked Nagumo's force that morning, 35 were destroyed. It was a staggering tactical failure, yet this fractured, desperate assault inadvertently paralyzed the Japanese counterstrike. Aboard the flagship Akagi, Vice Admiral Nagumo watched the American planes fall, but the continuous attacks forced his massive carriers into radical, high-speed evasive maneuvers. Ships like the Kaga and Soryu carved violent whitewater wakes into the ocean to dodge the incoming weapons. A carrier heeling hard over at 30 knots cannot launch a heavily loaded strike force. Aircraft would simply slide off the deck. Furthermore, the relentless low-level assaults had completely warped the Japanese defensive umbrella. The constant threat of torpedoes had drawn the entire combat air patrol down to the deck. Nearly 50 Zeros were now skimming just above the waves, furiously chasing the surviving devastators, burning through their ammunition and fuel, leaving the sky above the fleet completely empty. By 10:15, the last of the American torpedo planes were either falling away or fleeing. Nagumo's armada had survived unscathed. Not a single American weapon had struck a Japanese ship.
On the hangar decks, the frantic industrial chaos had finally subsided. The reserve aircraft were fueled, armed with anti-ship weapons, and being spotted for launch. The Japanese carriers turned into the wind. In minutes, Nagumo would unleash a coordinated counterstrike powerful enough to gut the United States Pacific Fleet. The fatal American ambush had seemingly shattered itself against the Japanese defenses, and the Imperial Navy was about to reclaim the battle. But the disjointed, fractured nature of the American assault, the very lack of coordination that doomed the torpedo squadrons, had inadvertently forged the perfect tactical setup. By dragging every Japanese Zero down to sea level to relentlessly chase the devastators, the torpedo bombers had completely stripped the protective fighter umbrella from the sky. Above 10,000 feet, the airspace over the first mobile strike force was entirely empty. The Japanese lookouts, their eyes glued to the horizon where the low-level threats had materialized, failed to scan the clouds directly above them. At exactly 10:20, plunging out of the scattered overcast at 15,000 feet, 3 squadrons of SBD Dauntless dive bombers from the Enterprise and Yorktown arrived over the Japanese fleet simultaneously. Lieutenant Commander Clarence Wade McCluskey led the Enterprise aircraft, while Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Leslie positioned the Yorktown squadron. They looked down and saw the sprawling wakes of the Japanese armada, the flight decks painted with massive red suns, turning directly into the wind. The absolute perfect alignment for a dive bomber. With a push of the stick, the Dauntlesses rolled over, extended their perforated dive flaps, and initiated a steep 70-degree plunge. They dropped at nearly 250 knots, the scream of their radial engines masking their approach until it was far too late. There was no anti-aircraft fire to disrupt their aim, no Zeros to intercept their descent. The American pilots had an unobstructed, textbook run at the heart of Japanese naval power. The Kaga was the first to buckle. 4 heavy bombs smashed into her flight deck and superstructure. The concussions shattered the bridge, eliminating her command staff, while the heavy, armor-piercing explosives punched deep into the ship's vitals. Seconds later, to the north, the Yorktown dive bombers swarmed the Soryu. 3 one-length 1,000-pound bombs tore through her wooden deck in rapid succession, paralyzing her engines and rupturing her aviation fuel mains. Then, a single Dauntless, piloted by Lieutenant Richard Best, lined up on the flagship Akagi. Releasing his 1,000-pound bomb at the last possible moment, Best scored a devastatingly precise hit on the midship elevator. The bomb plunged into the upper hangar deck and detonated. The sheer devastation of these strikes was not solely the result of American ordnance. It was the catastrophic culmination of the logistical crisis Vice Admiral Nagumo had battled all morning. The American bombs did not just strike empty ships. They detonated inside active, enclosed industrial work sites. The hangar decks of the Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu were packed tightly with the reserve strike force, dozens of aircraft fully fueled with thousands of gallons of highly volatile, unvented aviation gasoline.
Worse, the desperate, frantic orders to repeatedly change weapons over the previous hours had left hundreds of high-explosive land bombs and heavy aerial torpedoes stacked unsecured against the bulkheads. When the American bombs exploded inside these enclosed hangars, they triggered a horrific chain reaction. Within seconds, the Japanese ordnance detonated in a rolling series of massive, sympathetic explosions. Fuel lines ruptured, sending rivers of burning gasoline washing across the enclosed steel decks. The heavy elevators were blown completely out of their shafts, and the flight decks buckled upward under the intense internal pressure. The complex, highly disciplined mechanical choreography of the Imperial Japanese Navy evaporated in a blinding flash of heat and concussive force. In the span of roughly 5 minutes, 3 of the most powerful aircraft carriers on Earth, the untouchable core of the combined fleet, were reduced to uncontrollable, burning wrecks. The trap, meticulously designed to annihilate the United States Pacific Fleet, had instead consumed its own creators, severing the Japanese command structure and leaving the ocean covered in a sprawling shroud of black smoke. The destruction of the Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu occurred with breathtaking speed, but the battle was not instantly won. Farther to the north, obscured by localized squalls, the 4th Japanese carrier, Hiryu, remained untouched. Under the command of Rear Admiral Tamon Yamaguchi, the surviving vessel immediately generated a frantic, desperate counterattack.
Following the returning American strike planes, Japanese dive bombers and torpedo planes located the USS Yorktown. In 2 distinct waves that afternoon, they punched through the American combat air patrol. Yorktown absorbed heavy damage, but her damage control teams worked with such ruthless efficiency to patch the boilers and extinguish the fires that the second wave of Japanese attackers mistakenly believed they had found a completely different, undamaged carrier. Despite these stabilization efforts, fatal torpedo hits eventually forced the crew to abandon ship. Yorktown would linger as a crippled hulk for 2 days before the Japanese submarine I-168 ultimately sent her to the bottom, taking the escorting destroyer Hammond with her. But Hiryu's solitary resistance only delayed the inevitable. By launching her aircraft, the Japanese carrier had revealed her location.
Late that afternoon, an aggregated strike force of dive bombers from the Enterprise and the crippled Yorktown acquired the final target. Shortly before 1700, Dauntlesses plummeted from the sky, smashing 4 heavy bombs into Hiryu's forward flight deck. As the 4th and final pillar of the 1st Mobile Strike Force succumbed to uncontrolled fires, the operational architecture of the Midway invasion evaporated. Without an aviation umbrella, the massive Japanese surface fleet, still lingering hundreds of miles away, was effectively paralyzed. Operation MI was officially aborted. The Battle of Midway did not instantly end the Pacific War. 3 grueling years of naval attrition and brutal continental combat still lay ahead. Yet the events of early June fundamentally altered the strategic balance of naval power. In a single day, the Imperial Japanese Navy lost the irreplaceable veteran core of its fast carrier striking force, taking the lives of highly trained aviators and elite mechanics down with the burning hulls. The staggering loss permanently neutralized Tokyo's ability to project overwhelming offensive naval power across the vast expanses of the Pacific. The entire operational design, from Navy Order No. 18 to the massive dispersal of battleships and the rigid communication blackouts, was engineered to force the United States Navy into a decisive battle at a time and place of Japan's choosing. It was a mathematically precise ambush built on the fatal assumption of American blindness. But because naval intelligence shattered that illusion, Admiral Nimitz weaponized the Japanese timetable against them. By placing his outnumbered carriers in the exact right position ahead of schedule, he ensured that when the jaws of Yamamoto's trap finally snapped shut, it was the Imperial Japanese Navy that was already locked inside. The Imperial Japanese Navy sailed toward Midway with the absolute certainty that they were the hunters, orchestrating a masterclass in deception to crush a reacting foe. They engineered a battlefield that required the United States Navy to be blind, slow, and fatally predictable. Every dispersed battleship, every strict radio blackout, and every delayed submarine cordon was meticulously calibrated to spring a trap on an enemy that was supposed to arrive days late. Instead, they sailed directly into an ocean where their secure codes were broken, their operational timetable was exposed, and their own rigid assumptions were weaponized against them. They crossed thousands of miles of open water, fully expecting to lie in wait for a panicked rescue force. But when the morning overcast finally broke on June 4th, there was no ambush left to set. The trap was already waiting for them.